All right, good morning. My name is Hunter Broadwell. I'm one of the elders here at Live Oak Church. And Brian asked me to speak today. We're going to continue talking in the book of Ecclesiastes. So just before we get in, let's take a moment. Let's prepare our hearts, prepare our minds. Let's lift up our hearts and our minds to Him in prayer. So join me now. Lord Jesus, Lord, we praise your name today. Lord, we give you thanks. We give you thanks for just the ability to lift our voices to you. We give you thanks for worship. We give you thanks for just drawing us here together. We thank you for just what is sweet and good about community, about knowing one another, about just coming together to praise you. Lord, I pray that you would speak to each of our hearts today. Lord, I ask you to carry the words that are spoken today. I pray that you would just use them to build each of us up. Lord, I pray that you would give us insight. I pray that you would give us wisdom, that you would give us power. Lord, I praise your name forever, and I entrust all of this time to you. Amen. So I hope that yesterday everybody got to do something, or at least many of you got to do something really fun. I felt like yesterday was like the day of the year in terms of it just being ultimately nice. Like I love September. I love the fall. I love this kind of turn of the season. I appreciate kind of every dimension of the seasons here, but September is usually probably my favorite. I'm less anxious about it. Like in the summertime, I'm kind of clinging to summer. But when it gets to be fall, it just kind of washes over me and I enjoy it. And so yesterday, I got to play golf with my father-in-law and my son. And I don't play golf a whole lot. I just play on occasion. And, I've played golf enough to know pretty much how it's going to go. And so, I'm going to hit a handful of pretty good shots. I'm going to hit maybe one or two really great shots. I'm going to hit a whole lot of bad shots, just bad shots. And then I'm going to do some things that are pathetic, just really, really sad. And, and I think that's probably the experience for most people with golf, which is pretty amazing. And it's why they have the college kid riding around selling beer. And so, that is mostly the experience for folks. You catch a couple between the screws and it feels so good and it's so fun. That is, unless you're my father-in-law who is like a little golf robot, which is just like down the middle. He occasionally malfunctions, but not very much. So I'm out there playing golf yesterday, and it was funny because I look around and I see the blue sky, I see the green grass. We're like playing these holes that look down to the ocean. I'm there with my precious son. I'm watching him have a good time and play well. So I'm enjoying friendship, and I'm so mad. I'm just frustrated. And, I can picture myself like sitting over a putt and like trying to make it and just some sort of pathetic miss from 2 or 3 feet away. And I'm thinking, it is so hard to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. Like it is amazingly hard. I know what I need to do. It is so hard just to do this simple thing that needs to be done when it needs to be done. I can probably make all kinds of putts or hit all kinds of good shots on the practice green or on the driving range, but what about when it really, really counts? And so today, we're going to look at kind of probably maybe the more recognizable portion of Ecclesiastes through the lens of and in the context of learning to be able to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. One of the ways that we can think about freedom, like the freedom that God intends for us, is the ability to know what is good and then actually be able to do it. That is the core of biblical freedom. That is the core of, what Brian talks about is wisdom and skill in living. Can you recognize what needs to be done and then actually be able to bring it off? All right? So we're going to move kind of progressively through this really recognizable and sort of famous passage of Ecclesiastes. It's in Ecclesiastes 3. And I want to break it up and kind of take it piece by piece because I'm afraid if I read the whole thing to you, many of you will just despair and then check out because it hits you pretty hard out of the gate, or at least it does me, okay? So the first thing we encounter in verse 1 of Ecclesiastes 3 is that for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. So, many of you recognize this. You kind of know where it's going. There's a time for everything. There is a season for everything. And so, one of the things that the commentators talk about when they look at this passage is that this section in particular, it's poetry. In the Old Testament and in the wisdom literature, you see a lot of like poetic kind of references and efforts. And one of the things about poetry, and I know this because I took a poetry writing class in college, is that good poetry uses concrete images in order to convey ideas with the force of emotion. It takes this concrete image that you can kind of get your heart and your mind around and feel, and it uses that to impart an idea. And so we're going to see as we go through this, these first 8 verses or so, kind of a poetic movement where the writer, he's touching different nerves. He's causing us to feel things through these images. And so as we read through it, I would encourage you to lean into that and think about, all right, as I hear this, what do I feel? When I'm thinking about season, and when I'm thinking about times and occasions, like, how does that intersect with me? How does that make me feel right now? Like, what is my season right now? Is it a good season? Is it a hard season? Is it full of sunny days? Is it full of rain and clouds? Like, what am I walking through right now? And so, just as we dig into that, just let that wash over you. Let that hit you. Like, how do these images interact with your heart? Now, this first verse, when it talks about everything being ordained, things being ordered, one of the points that it's driving home is that kind of almost like it's almost like a trope, or it's almost like an overused phrase or an oversimplified phrase. God has a plan for my life. God has a plan for my life. We're thinking about God has specific intentions. He has specific purposes for windows of time in my life. He has a specific idea about how I engage in and what I do with certain moments. God has a plan for my life. And as we're going to roll into more of the poem, we're going to see that very simple idea is, in point of fact and on the ground, really, really complicated. So let's look as we start progressing through what he says. As we roll into verse 2, he says, there is a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. How do you feel inside when you read that passage? To be transparent with you, I feel overwhelmed by that passage. And I think that I tend to focus in on and I think about those images and the feelings associated with those images that I don't like, or maybe that I'm afraid of. I don't want to die. I don't want to weep. I don't want to mourn. I don't want to tear things down. It feels heavy, when I read that sometimes. There's another poem that hits me kind of with similar force. It's a poem about this guy named Donald Justice, and it's called Men at 40. And the first line of this poem says, "Men at 40 learn to close softly the doors to rooms which they will not be coming back to." And when I read that, I'm like, oh, God. I'm hit with the force of that image of just kind of closing the door on a phase of life. When we were getting ready for the service today, I was sitting in the back with Michael, and he's got his 2 little girls on his lap, and they're climbing all over him. And I just, that is a wonderful season of life. It's a little hard to see in the midst of it, and we're going to talk about that today. But, you do close the door on those seasons of life. And man, it feels heavy and it feels hard. And like, how do you walk in that? And so, like I said, I tend to fixate on the things that tend to sound scary. I also think about the things in that passage that sound really tough to me. Like, I struggle with keeping silent when I need to keep silent. Sometimes I struggle with speaking when I need to speak. I tend to struggle with engaging in conflict, or maybe letting things go that I don't need to be in conflict about. And so I think the point for me and the impact for me is just, this is a declaration around the complexity of our lives. Our lives are super rich and full of good things. They're full of hard things. They're full of scary things. They're full of mystery. And it's very difficult to know what to do in the right moment. It's very difficult to know what to do and when. And so this poem sets up with force just our situation. And so it's easy to sit back and feel, wow, like life can feel overwhelming. I don't know, like some of you may be in that place right now where, man, life just feels hard. It feels overwhelming. It feels impossible to understand. And maybe even more realistically, there are probably dimensions of life that feel like the positive side of this list. And then there are other dimensions of life that are more consistent with the harder or the more negative side of this list. And that is the nature of life for all of us. And so like the teacher, who is kind of the speaker that we're encountering in Ecclesiastes, he gets this. He is making this point, and he moves us from poetry into rhetoric. And so he's going to ask a rhetorical question to follow up on what he's been talking about. And so in verses 9 and 10, this is what he says. "What gain has the worker from all his toil? I have seen the business that God has given the children of man to be busy with." All right, so here he's my paraphrase here is he's just saying like, what do we get out of all of this? This is quite hard. What is it we get out of all of this? And how do we deal with just these complex, burdensome, even wearisome sort of things that God has assigned to us in life in many cases? And just so you know why I'm throwing a negative slant on that question. Obviously, God gives us responsibilities that are, things that are deeply satisfying and easy and good and fun, and then there's other things that are hard. But in context, what the commentators say when they look at the language that they see where we're thinking about words like toil and the way, the business that we've been assigned, in the original language, in the Hebrew, the slant on it is kind of like affliction, painful. I see kind of the painful stuff God has given us to deal with. What do we get out of this? And that's a question that I think if we're honest with ourselves, we ask a good bit when we're encountering some of the challenges of life. And so, he's gonna begin to turn a corner and answer his question. Okay? So we've kind of been on a descent. We're gonna start kind of coming up out of the hole. Okay? Now, what he says next is really interesting, and it's a shift of perspective. All right? In the next two verses, he goes on to say, God has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. This one, I think if you just read through Ecclesiastes and kind of blow through it, a lot of these feel a little disjointed. Like they're kind of independent ideas, like, oh yeah, everything's beautiful at a certain point. Everybody has their moment. And, we have eternity in our hearts. We anticipate heaven, and, one day we're going to go be with him. But I don't think that really squarely captures what the teacher is saying here, because he's giving us a cohesive picture. He's bringing us from one place to another, all right? He's starting us out with the reality that God has a plan for us, but it's extremely complicated. And we've got a lot of responsibility to lean into that plan and discern what is going on. And that feels overwhelming and hard. But at the same time, it's not left there. There is actually a path through the complexity that, kind of in the words of the psalmist, is a level path or a straight path. And the teacher is going to bring us to that place. So we're going to move from like complexity overwhelming to simple and encouraging. All right? And he begins that shift by making some observations about the nature of God and what he has done, and more importantly, about us. So, when it says God makes everything beautiful in its time, the commentators also explain that when you're looking at the Hebrew here, the way to think about it, or a way to think about it, is in the context of fit. Have you ever heard somebody say that fits beautifully? Like maybe when you're doing some woodworking and you've done like a complicated joint and it just fits perfectly into place. Or you've got like a t-shirt or a shirt you really like that just it's a good fit. It fits beautifully. All right? This is the context that we're thinking about here. There is a perfectly fitted plan. God has taken all of these jagged pieces and he fits them together beautifully. All right? There is, it's interesting, there's this form of art in the Far East where vessels like pottery are shattered and then put back together using this kind of like gold adhesive. And the broken thing is more beautiful than the vessel that started. So God is fitting these jagged pieces together perfectly. All right? So that's the teacher's first observation. He then goes on to point out important limitations around how we interact with that. All right? He says, God has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot see what is happening from the beginning to the end. All right? Now, the word eternity here is kind of the subject of some dispute among the Bible scholars. And this is a funny dispute, and I think it teaches us kind of a good little mini lesson about how God preserves his word and communicates his word through imperfection. So the scholars look at that word eternity, and they're not sure what the original writer actually wrote. Some of them say this is actually a misspelled word. It is a defective usage of the word. And it is a defective usage of the word that points to a sense of time beyond the present, or maybe forever, or the age or the world to come. Others look at it and say, well, no, if you strip the vowels out of it, which is how Hebrew was rendered, this is actually this other word that means darkness and obscurity. And here's what I love about that. God is competent to preserve his word and convey the richness of his meaning, even through typos. all right? Because those things actually fit together quite nicely. We have in our hearts a sense of time outside of ourselves. We have in our hearts an awareness of a potential future, even a forever. And yet, it's obscured. We have like this horizon that we can't see past that is built into us. And as a result, we can never fully appreciate the big picture. We have eternity in our hearts. And we know, and God has fit everything together perfectly in such a way that we can't quite see it. And I think like the longer I follow Jesus, the more skeptical I am of my understanding of his will or his plan. And I guess what I mean by that is there have been plenty of times in my life where I'll see something happen and I'm like, all right, I know what God's doing. And I jump to all these conclusions and I start making plans around it. And it's just part of it. It's just part of the learning process. Now I tend to be a little more reserved about jumping to conclusions about what God is doing. I think I try not to be too quick to say, oh, well, God's in this way, because I have eternity in my heart. There's this horizon beyond which I cannot see. All right? And so he's pointing out to us an inherent and a designed and an intentional limitation that he's put into place, like part of how we have been designed. The way this ends up playing out in practice is tough, all right? Because, I think particularly like in our modern era, there is a dark side to this horizon and this ignorance that kind of corrupts us in life and makes life so much harder than it needs to be, all right? So, like in the 17th century, there was this theologian and mathematician and inventor, kind of Renaissance man named Blaise Pascal. And some of you guys might have heard of him. He's a lot of times he's considered a pretty important thinker in the history of the church. And in some of his writings, he talks about kind of our conundrum, our problem in this respect, like the idea of eternity in our hearts. And here's what he says. And this is like really rough paraphrase, but he says, we tend to wander around in times that are other than our own. We're always anticipating the future and trying to hurry it along. We're always looking back at the past and trying to slow it down from fleeing away from us. We almost never think about and focus on our present, where God actually is and is doing and is seeking obedience. Instead, we're lost in the future, which tends to be kind of imaginary. Or we're lost in the past, which is fixed and done. We are always planning and preparing to live and not actually living. We're always planning and preparing to be happy, and so it is inevitable that we should never be so. And, when I read and I hear that, I see myself. I see myself kind of clamoring for a future. I see myself sort of being dismissive of the present and just being anxious about what is next, what is next, what is next. I think an image in my mind that really sums it up is like sometimes and in the past I've tried to do like an involved date or event or like special occasion for my wife, and I'll have a pretty elaborate plan, and I get really distracted executing the plan instead of just enjoying what we're doing, And so, we're in the car, I'm thinking about the dinner. We're eating dinner, I'm thinking about the dessert. We're thinking about dessert, I'm thinking about the show. It's just always clamoring for what is next. Because I've got sort of this broken relationship to time and to eternity, all right? And so where the writer of Ecclesiastes leads us next is to push back on that and to give us a really simple remedy for that. Not necessarily easy to implement, but simple, okay? And here's what he says. I perceive that there is nothing better than for them, for us, for people, to be joyful and do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. And so, he presents what I think is a little bit counterintuitive. In the face of life being complicated, hard to understand, there being a lot of responsibility, there being a lot of uncertainty, instead of bearing down and gritting your teeth and working really hard to figure it out, his counsel is pursue joy. It feels rather opposite. It feels opposite from what I want to do. He says, pursue joy. He puts down, in a very simple way, the radical idea that we need to enjoy our life. And so, that's a question to kind of reflect on all of us. Are you enjoying your life? And think about the people that you know enjoy their life. Think about the people that you interact with and what it's like to be with somebody who just enjoys life. They're full of laughter. They're focusing in on things that are good. They're full of gratitude. Enjoy your life. The thing that is so challenging about that, and Sam and I were, having a dialogue about that this morning, is sometimes that feels impossible. All right, yeah, thanks for the advice. Life's really complicated. I just need to enjoy my life. I need to experience joy. And so we need to lean into, from a practical perspective, how does that work? How do we do that? How do we approach doing that? How is that something that we can really get on the ground? All right? I know in some of the seasons of my life, and I think one of the areas that I'm just going to focus in on here is in the area of work, because it's pretty straightforward to enjoy meals and to enjoy company, to enjoy, as he says, eating and drinking. But it can be really hard to enjoy our work. A lot of us at different points, we experience work as suffering. We experience work as an encroachment on the things that we really want to do. In some cases, how does that change? How do we lean into the idea of doing good and getting satisfaction and enjoying our work in accordance with what is being kind of prescribed and described here? And so, when I was in my late 30s, I was working in a job that, it was crushing to me. My work was absolutely crushing to me. It was wearisome toil. And, I thought about, why was it so hard? Why did I struggle so much in that season, okay? And I remember, my experience of the day when I'd get to work was, from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, people all over the world, it was they were just tapping my shoulder. Hunter, 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 Hunter. Just all day long. I need something. And so all day long, I was in a hurry. I was in a hurry. And when I say I was in a hurry, I meant my mindset was focused on, I've got to do stuff really fast. I've got to respond immediately. I've got to look good to all of these people that are asking me for things. I've got to bring the future on as quickly as I can. I was just thinking of this anxious rhythm of life. And after a while, it really starts wearing on you deeply, at a deep level, kind of almost bringing me to a place of depression, And I think that lesson in that season of life for me is that hurry, that type of mindset, it drains joy out of life. It is just a ground wire for joy in your life. And this connects with, a comment from a theologian named Dallas Willard. And if you've talked to me for more than 10 minutes, you've heard me talk about Dallas Willard. And, he was giving counsel to a younger pastor who was saying, hey, what do I need to do to build up my church? And, what's going to really get things going at my church? And I think he was asking for a program or a teaching series or something. And Dallas Willard looked at him and said, you need to ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. And his response was, no, like what kind of books do I read? What kind of like Sunday school programs do we need? He said, no. You need to transform the sort of man that you are, because that's what you're going to give to your people. That's what you're going to give to the people around you. You need to ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. And I think that his advice just connects with the reality that, we cannot be who God calls us to be when we're in a hurry, because it drains all the joy out of us. All right? And this is a really, really important and simple cue and clue for us, because what I'm not saying around eliminating hurry from life is that you should be slow. It's not like the scene in Zootopia where the sloth is working at the DMV. Like, that's not what I'm encouraging. The point is, you can do things urgently and quickly and not be in a hurry. All right? My wife brought home this really funny cocktail napkin the other day, and it said, procrastination is great. You never have anything to do today, and there's always something to do tomorrow. And it's like, no. Like, that's not what I'm saying. Like, so, when I made that realization at work about hurry, and I began to kind of transition into, I'm not going to hurry. I'm going to focus on what I'm doing. I'm going to work on these documents I'm working on one sentence at a time. Something really interesting happened. I started to enjoy it. I started to see that it could be artistic. There could be craftsmanship in what I was doing. I started to think, I actually kind of like this. This is actually good. When I started rejecting the expectations and opinions of others that were pretty much imaginary in my mind, and I was able just to sit in an unhurried way, just doing the exact same thing that I had been doing before, but draining that hurry and that anxiousness out of my life. And so, my boss at the time, he had this great lens, and I would encourage all of you to think about this. I talked with my kids about this. He would say, Hunter, what experience does future Hunter want to have? Like next week, when you have to give this presentation, what do you want that to be like? That morning, do you want to be scrambling around trying to get your slides together and remembering what you're going to say and, asking finance for this thing or do you want to have already sent everything out 2 or 3 days before, have a cup of coffee, walk in prepared and good to go? I got to take care of future Hunter. And I realized that I'd been scrambling around in a hurry and just wearing out future Hunter. I had not been taking good care of future Hunter. And this applies to all kinds of dimensions. And so think about even the counsel here where it says, enjoy eating and drinking. That to enjoy eating and drinking, we have to kind of be thoughtful and plan things out. We're not slapping something in the microwave at the last minute. Enjoy your life. Structure your life thoughtfully and with wisdom so that you can be unhurried. And so, there is this responsibility that flows into us here, but it's about just taking a step back, not responding to things that feel like expectations that are so often imaginary, and just in an unhurried way, planning the enjoyment of your life. And so, I think this is something that everybody I know kind of tends to struggle with. And the author of Ecclesiastes, he underpins his point with kind of a much more theological or universal level reality. Because he puts a bow on it saying, I perceived that what God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it. Nothing can be taken from it. God has done it, so that people fear before him. That which already has been, that which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. God's not going to forget anything. And so, I think one of the grounding principles that we got to hear out of that is remembering that, God is in charge. His will is bigger than our mistakes or our failures or our weaknesses. Because when I look back across seasons of my life, I obviously haven't handled things not even close to perfectly, and yet his grace has covered it. Things that I failed in, he redeemed. Things that I failed in, he used to teach me and build me up. And so, I think remembering his sovereignty, God is in charge and his will is bigger than our weaknesses, gives us just kind of like a nice platform from which to operate in an unhurried and a confident way. There was a monk back in the 17th century. His name was Jean-Pierre Cassade, and he talked about the sacrament of the present moment. And in the sacrament of the present moment, he's saying, we are looking on our circumstances and the things that God's put right in front of us, and we trust it. We trust it as the clearest possible expression of his will to us at any given point in time. And we look on them with the eyes of faith, which anticipates beyond the horizon in our heart his good plan, his good purposes, and his perfect fit. And so just to fully land the plane on joy, I want us just all to remember and think about Jesus' words in John 15, right before what Sam was talking about. And in John 15, that's the famous, abide in me, I'm the vine, you are the branches. But he concludes all that he says there with the statement that I love you, I love you. And my intention is that you live in my love. I love you, and my intention is that you live in my love. If you put my words into practice, you're going to understand. And you're going to understand my love. And I'm telling you this so that my joy will be inside of you. My joy, Jesus' joy, will be inside of us. And our joy will be complete. And so that is a really good, solid directive that pairs up and couples up with the teacher's counsel here. And that is to say, Jesus, the Lord of heaven and earth, whose name is above all names, who has created all things, who is the author of life, who died on the cross to redeem and to restore and to draw you into his kingdom, into his family, wants you to experience his joy. He is calling us to live our lives in a way where we pursue joy, engage with it, and interact with it. So let's just go out today remembering that and thinking about how can I lean into the present moment? How can I look for what God is doing in the present moment? And how can I arrange my life to pursue joy?